Okay, everyone, we might get started. It is 11:30. Oh, how well behaved you are. Not like traditional students at all. Well, hello everyone, good morning, and welcome to, well, firstly to the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. It is very hot outside, but it is still very lovely today, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, as we are here to talk, to learn, to share experiences, activities that have been happening on these traditional lands for a long time. My name is Darren Lim. I am an academic here at the ANU. It took me about 15 minutes to walk here from my office over in the RSSS building, so I'm a little bit sweaty. Please forgive that. But I'm here to moderate a panel, panel 5A, just to make sure that you're all in the correct room, titled Interrogating Australia's Pacific Integration Agenda. And on today's panel, we are going to have contributions from 4 different people. On my far left here, we have Natasha Turia, who is a PhD student here at the ANU in the Department of Pacific Affairs, and she's also a research officer at the Development Policy Centre. To her right, we have Jan Hutton, who is a First Assistant Secretary of the Pacific Integration Division in the Office of the Pacific at DFAT. And to my immediate left, we have Bridi, CEO and founder of the Development Intelligence Lab. And of course, you'll have seen these wonderful reports that are scattered around here. Hopefully everyone has got a copy. The lab has just released a report on this very issue. Now, we have a contribution from a 4th person as well, Wilson O'Neill, who is the Director of Financial Analysis and Supervision Unit within the Bank of Papua New Guinea. So he's a central banker and a leading banking reformer in PNG. We will hear from him via video, but unfortunately he cannot join us for the live Q&A due to other commitments in his job. The plan for today is Bridi is going to lead us off with some comments based around this report, I'm sure. We'll hear then some recorded content, both from Wilson but also from Natasha, and then we'll finish with Jan for a perspective on the government. And at that point, we'll move to Q&A. I might abuse the privileges of the chair for a few moments, but I'll be very keen to turn it over for your questions and perspectives as well, and we can have a really good, robust conversation. So with that, Bridi, over to you.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. What I thought I would do is actually kick off with a very brief description of where the idea to have this panel, to write this paper, to interrogate this issue came from. So as somebody who works in a think tank, I regularly find myself as a boundary rider, right? Just academic enough to spend time with people in the research community like so many of you here. Just government enough to spend my days working side by side with Australian policymakers in DFAT, at Parliament, trying to understand our world, trying to make a best guess about what Australia's next move should be. And also just development organisation enough to have me and my staff out in the region, in partner countries where Australia works, trying to kind of interpret a motivation that was made in Canberra and how it might possibly work on the ground in a project in somewhere like Papua New Guinea, Nauru, Indonesia, or elsewhere. And what I find is that as we move through these different communities, we're often having informal conversations with people who are imbuing a different main motivation for Australia in the Pacific, a different main game. Right, so many of us in this room will consider the main game for Australia in the Pacific to be dictated by Australia's development policy, right? Australia engages in the Pacific primarily for a purpose of poverty alleviation and development and everything that that entails. And that's logical, right? Easily about half of Australia's spend into the Pacific is ODA money. But as I move through other circles, I often hear or imbue that really the main motivation for other actors, be they in government or national security, commercial environments as well, is actually Australia's ambition in the geostrategic competition, what Penny Wong describes as that permanent state of contest in the region, put simply and very bluntly, preventing a Chinese military base in the Pacific. And if that's your main game in the Pacific, then you're probably acting a little different. And then so too, as we move through these different communities, we also see people who see Australia's main game in the Pacific as reorientating Australia's identity. It's about being a partner of choice. It's being about legitimately a member of the Pacific family. And as we see these different kind of views bubbling beneath the surface of our various communities about what Australia's main game is in the Pacific, we naturally get pretty curious. And so the lead authors of this paper, Miracilis Dianto, as well as Geordie Fung from the lab, and I, would come home into the lab and sort of say, hang on, what is going on here? Everybody's telling a different story about what Australia's dominant motivation in the Pacific is. And what kept bubbling to the surface again and again and again was this idea of integration. Not just cooperating with the Pacific, not just providing assistance with the Pacific, but integrating. And there are different logics at play when you're talking about whether or not one of the central motifs of Australia's engagement in the Pacific is actually an agenda of integration. And so as this bubbled to the surface, we couldn't find it written down anywhere. There is no public policy saying Australia has an integration agenda. And whenever that happens and whenever big new policy paradigms emerge, there are pros and cons, there are tensions, and we need to find a language to talk about it. So that is what is behind this work today. And it is a level of recognition that as a development community, if we care about development in the Pacific, we care about backing Pacific-led development, then so too should we care about a range of activities that are happening both within the ODA budget, but way beyond as well. So today I'm going to speak briefly about what we saw in this integration set of activities, the sorts of areas where we're seeing the most energy in these integration activities, and then finish with some of the tensions that I know will be the subject of the conversation from there. So there is no perfect agenda, there's no policy out there that says what integration is, but our best guess is that it can be understood as a pattern of activities and agreements. Okay, but these activities and agreements are not just like your regular aid project. They have some particular features. They're activities that look to link economies and institutions both within the Pacific as well as with Australia. They are often, although not always, activities that privilege the joint priorities of governments, right? When you're negotiating a government-government treaty like the Palapeli Union, it is primarily the priorities of governments that are being discussed, same too with the Puk Puk Treaty. It is about deepening not just cooperation, but interdependence, the way that defence forces work together, the way that banking systems integrate with each other. And often, when we're talking about the deal-making that is going on between Australia and the Pacific, it embeds both explicit and implicit mutual obligations. Australia promises to Tuvalu that we will recognise that nation as a nation, even as sea levels rise and they lose their land, right? But so too will Tuvalu promise to consult and engage with Australia before entering into a security or a critical infrastructure deal with another player. We know we're talking about China there, okay? And of course, these activities don't just fall within a rubric of security or development or simply a soft power diplomacy piece, but they're often reinforcing mutual objectives for Australia. So whilst integration is not new, it's been a long-standing aspiration, particularly a demand coming out of the Pacific Islands for greater integration with Australia. We certainly see that the last 18 months, that pace, that volume, that energy, the visibility of it, there's something new in there, okay? So in the last 18 months alone, we've seen that Palapeli Union come into force. We've seen the expansion of the Pacific Engagement Visa that you're going to hear Natasha speak about. We've seen the Australia PNG NRL partnership, my personal favourite corridor conversation at this conference has been the examination of that partnership. We've seen so too the rollout and the connection of our media and information flows as the ABC heads back into the Pacific. Of course, there is the recent PNG Puk Treaty and a near finalised Nakamal Treaty with Vanuatu, and the passing of the Pacific Banking Guarantee Bill, the short case study you'll hear from Wilson, that is looking to guarantee that Australian banks are viable and can stay back in the Pacific. But it's not just us that is seeing these activities, and that was a short list. The list goes way longer than that. So too is Australian leaders. So Penny Wong recently at the Australian Institute for International Affairs dinner gave a speech where she described Australia as we don't just live here, we aren't just residents, we are architects. A vision of Australia connecting different countries in the region, connecting Australia to those countries as well. But this hasn't just been a very convenient speech that was given 10 days before this panel. It has been something that has been building over the last couple of years. So we have the Prime Minister, when talking about the Puk Treaty, talking about its increased operability, its increased engagement between Australia and PNG. We have Penny Wong talking specifically to the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, explicitly saying, we have partnered to better integrate our economies. And perhaps the strongest representation of this is Pat Conroy, Minister for Pacific, who said the Albanese government's Pacific agenda runs as deep as it does broad. It is a multidimensional approach that aims to better integrate us with the region around us. So this energy is new, but the long-standing aspiration is certainly not. Richard Marles wrote a book about this way before he was in the position he is in now. Stephen Howes and his team here at DevPol have been working for over a decade on things like labour mobility and migration, activities that look to integrate and connect Australia with the Pacific. Just a few years ago, Charles Kenny came to this conference and proposed an EU-style pact for the Pacific, and more recently, people like Darren and others are also examining the rubric. Hervé Lemayeux from Lowy, now in DFAT as well. But the one thing that remains, I think, is best captured by Graham Dobell up here, where he described one of the central tensions of this desire for integration, no matter how positive it is for Australia and its partners in the Pacific. And that is that integration asks the South Pacific to compromise a level of sovereignty, to trust and benefit from Australia's economic and security opportunities and leadership. And so what we find in practice is that this extraordinary patchwork of activities, this emerging narrative of integration, a division in the Department of Foreign Affairs where this agenda is expressed, we find that if you map all of these, you can broadly break them down into 4 intersecting domains. Now, whenever you do that, you're going to make mistakes. They really overlap. It's hard to differentiate. But at this point in time, we see the main integration activities between Australia and the Pacific largely falling into a security domain, okay? Defence cooperation, policing, other sorts of mutual obligation relationships. You see them sustained in a development domain. Think infrastructure financing, direct budget support, these sorts of things. You see integration in economic domains, labour mobility, visas, movement, banking guarantees, and you see it often in societal domains. Think ABC connected back into the region, greater connections between churches and everything in between. But like any new paradigm, like any new policy, there are tensions. And the thing that we can't see and that we're grappling with, we think at the moment, is the question of, yes, if we're going after integration, that's fine, but for what purpose? And as we boundary ride through all of the different communities and we hear an examination of 1 or 2 of the different activities or agreements at play, what we hear back is that they all mean something different to different people. Okay, so for some in the community, This agenda, these activities are about responding to long-standing Pacific priorities. It's about recognising climate change as an existential crisis and recognising Tuvalu after sea level rise means that country doesn't have land. For others, it's about mitigating risks to Pacific sovereignty, getting behind cables that are secure and enable Pacific partners to have secure access to internet and reduce the risks of foreign interference there. For others, this integration agenda and these activities are classic soft power projection of trust and influence, access to Australian ABC in the Pacific being an example of that one. But the last two potential motivations behind this agenda are ones that we see less public discussion of. And that is that these arrangements, just like Dobell said way back, and still we're navigating now, these arrangements are also increasingly set up to align the interests of Australia with the Pacific, to bind our nations closer together. And in some instances, as we watch a level of transactionalism come into foreign policy emanating out of the US, but so too closer to home, where New Zealand has removed aid dollars from the Cook Islands for their relationship that was increasingly close with China, so too does the natural question arise that these activities are also potentially the source of leverage, not just for Australia over the Pacific, but the Pacific potentially over Australia as well. So amidst these competing tensions, amidst this agenda that we're mapping out, we see that ahead is a few really interesting questions for Australia. So the first is, we have an increasing array of integration style activities across the domains that I mentioned up here, but what's next? Do we have an education integration agenda, for example? Is there potential to integrate healthcare systems or really double down on labour and migration? Can we afford it? Right? Australia has spent 9% of its Commonwealth budget on international affairs across defence, intelligence, foreign affairs, trade, aid, and some of the home affairs work internationally. We've spent 9% of that budget for 25 years. That international spend has not shifted for Australia. And yet these activities don't necessarily come cheap. So we can see a budget question on the horizon for Australia in this work. And most interestingly, as these activities generate more and more interdependence, more and more mutual obligations, what happens when one party does not stick and play by the rules? What happens when that is tested? And these are things that I think are absolutely fascinating for many of us in the academic space, but I think as development practitioners, the question I'm left asking myself is, if we are serious about development results and backing the aspirations of Pacific communities and their development trajectories, then we can't just be looking at the ODA pie and the familiar projects that we monitor, evaluate and design, the tea leaves that we're reading as we see more and more DFAT designs blend ODA with non-ODA expenditure, as we see more and more announcements that suggest that integration is becoming a central motif for Australia in the Pacific, then it follows that we're asking ourselves, how do you maximise these opportunities for a development impact here? And how do we navigate what will inevitably be some rocky terrain as we all work out how we're functioning together in a very different looking world order? So with that, I've given a sort of a bird's eye view of the integration agenda. I'm just going to pass over, we've got two pre-record case studies. The first one is from Natasha Turia on the Pacific Engagement Visa, who of course is here. We'll hear that one first, and then we'll go straight to Wilson O'Neill, who'll be talking about the Pacific Banking Guarantee. Darren thought it would be really good to get a little bit more concrete at this point. Thanks.
So what is the Pacific Engagement Visa? The Pacific Engagement Visa, or the PEV for short, is Australia's landmark migration policy with the region aimed at increasing its Pacific diaspora and strengthening its people-to-people connections with the Pacific family. Annually, up to 3,000 eligible citizens between the age of 18 to 45 years old and who hold a valid passport from one of the participating countries can register in the PEV ballot for a chance to live permanently in Australia. It's a self-sponsored visa. So this year, 11 countries participated: Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Now, in the region, New Zealand is the only other developed country that has operated a longer-running PEV equivalent known as the Pacific Access category. It also operates another permanent resident visa ballot exclusively for citizens from Samoa. And this year, Australia launched its second PEV stream, which is exclusive to citizens to Tuvalu as part of the co-designed Whalepili Union provisions. Annually, Australia will welcome up to 280 Tuvalu citizens via the Whalepili Mobility Pathway, also known as the Whalepili Visa. What are the positives? Well, there are two big positives. First, the PEV is an open online registration process, not restricted to skill level or place of residence. This means that anyone who meets the age and citizenship requirement and has access to a credit card to pay the ballot fee, which is 25 Australian dollars, can register. Once the ballot closes, and if you are lucky enough to be randomly selected, you will be invited to start the visa process, just like applying for any other type of permanent resident visa. Second, it's a highly preferential visa for the Pacific that exclusively gives PEV winners access to the same social benefits that Australian citizens have, like Medicare, childcare subsidy, and family benefits. Now, regionally, since Australia has now introduced two PEV streams, which is similar to New Zealand, the conversations for freer movement across the Pacific will only intensify. Freer movement has been identified as a key driver in advancing economic integration outcomes. What are the challenges? The immediate challenge now is making the PEV work better and setting up a roadmap for better freer movement visa settings for the region. There are lessons to be learned from the PEV and the difficulties particularly around applicants' experiences to successfully secure a formal 12-month job offer as part of the visa requirement. Basically, no job offer, no PEV. At the Development Policy Center, Professor Stephen Howes and I have showed that it's been a slow start to the PEV. Not all 3,000 visas from the 2024 round have been granted, and securing a job offer coupled with long visa delays will persist for PEV winners for each subsequent round until Australia reviews its current PEV settings to make it work better. What's obvious, though, is many education qualifications gained in the Pacific are not recognized by Australian industries to gain direct entry into the workplace. This demonstrates the lack of accredited education and training qualifications required for freer movement that a European-like format could possibly, if delivered in the Pacific, can unlock. Moving forward, how do we make it work better? There's no doubt the PEV will grow in popularity as will regional conversations around freer mobility escalate. In my opinion, self-sponsored permanent migration pathways like the PEV are Australia's next to best non-aid instrument. It enhances agency to the beneficiary, that is, PEV winners' ability to pursue better opportunities and self-empowerment. It is a launch pad for greater and bigger regional integration outcomes. But genuine integration will only work if the infrastructure on the Australian side that includes Pacific literacy is set up to receive incoming PEV migrants. The PEV and any other permanent migration pathway with the Pacific needs to operate as a trusted migration pathway set up for success, giving confidence to the Pacific that their sacrifices are worth every cent spent to participate in the PEV. After all, they will call Australia their home too. There is still more work to be done, and it only makes sense for Australia to get more serious about making it easier for citizens from the Pacific to travel more freely into their borders, and the PEV is only just the beginning of this new frontier moving forward.
My name is Wilson Onea. I'm the director for FASU, which is short for the Financial Analysis and Supervision Unit. It is housed within the Central Bank of Papua New Guinea, and it is Papua New Guinea's financial intelligence unit, the equivalent of OSTREC in Australia. At this moment, I will be speaking to you about the Pacific Banking Guarantee. So I have a few observations to make. And firstly, I'd like to start by perhaps introducing what this guarantee is about. It's basically an initiative aimed at providing incentives to commercial banks to continue to operate in the Pacific, to curtail various risks, and by offering these guarantees, particularly by the Australian government. And we here in the middle part of this year, the Australian government was able to show its commitment to this initiative by passing the Guarantee Act 2025. How has this been received? Perhaps let me just highlight a few positives about this. What this does is it gives Australia to be directly, or the opportunity to be directly involved in the affairs or in the livelihoods of the people of the Pacific. At a time when the Pacific has been vulnerable to the harsh compliance standards that are imposed globally. And so without it limits the livelihoods of the small island nations. This initiative also enables and fosters and strengthens trade and essential services. That is, again, basically, fosters a strong livelihood of our people. As they say, money talks. And so in this case, Australia's Pacific integration policy and all its programs under this policy cannot be delivered without the banking services in the Pacific. So yes, it's a plus for the people. However, there are concerns as well that some of us quietly are concerned about. And those concerns are around the regulatory aspects of this guarantee scheme. It is not clear as to what some of the oversight mechanisms are, or how do you deal with liabilities or claims against guarantees that may arise. And this is particularly concerning for Australian taxpayers. On a broader sense, compliance with broader international standards also is a concern for us. Does this guarantee provides an exemption? And if so, what risks does this facility pose for the wider community? There needs to be more transparency. Therefore, there needs to be more transparency in the guarantee process. In terms of money laundering, counterterrorism, and proliferation financing, there are risks that exist, and like with any other product or any other channel of banking, it comes with inherent risks, and therefore we do not rule out some of these money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation risks. The other concern that remains as well is market distortion as a result of this guarantee, as and when it is introduced into the various financial systems of the Pacific, and how this could potentially create an uneven playing field for competitors within the banking sector. So yes, that remains a quiet concern as well for some of us that are in the practice of AML, CTF, and CPF. Having said that, what is there to look out for? Well, the key developments is when the facility will be rolled out, how and when. Since the Brisbane Banking Forum in 2024, it's pretty much gone quiet. And so, yes, we anticipate the rollout of this guarantee in the not too distant future. Thank you for listening to me.
Good afternoon or good morning. I'm not sure which one we are. I think we're spot on 12 o'clock. Thanks very much for inviting me along today. Can I just begin, though, by also acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on here today, the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respect also to their elders, past, present and emerging. What I really like to do, though, is acknowledge the contribution they make, not just to the life of our city, but every day to our working life in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's my first time at the conference, so I'm very excited, but also as the title, my job title, kind of gives it away, responsibility for the Pacific Integration Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I have a particular interest in today's discussion, so thank you. I'll begin by just saying a few words, and I think we've got a Q&A session afterwards, which I'm sure will be much more interesting. But can I just begin by saying I absolutely agree, Bridi, with the finding in the paper from the Development Intelligence Lab that puts forward the proposition that Australia's ambition to integrate with the Pacific is not new. That's absolutely the case. It reflects a long-standing and bipartisan aspiration, really, to knit Australia and the Pacific economies, our institutions, our infrastructure and our societies together, to build those closer ties and to deepen our connections. I guess, Bridi, the one point of difference perhaps is the terminology. We don't think of it in terms of an integration agenda. We really think of it in terms of our integration interests. Integration is how we advance our shared interests with our Pacific partners and how we navigate what we see as increasingly shared spaces with our Pacific partners. We know we share an ocean and a future, and we also have an absolute shared commitment in ensuring we live in a peaceful, prosperous and stable region. A really important point I'd like to make to all of you in this room is integration really is shaped by Pacific priorities. Our objective is to create as many choices, is the way we think about it, for our Pacific partners, but to absolutely rely and leave it to them on which of Australia's integration offers they wish to take up, and increasingly how they wish to take them up, and rely on their assessments and their judgments how they support their own national interests, including their development aspirations. As Bridi said in your opening remarks, Bridi, integration occurs across a spectrum. So from mutually agreed treaty commitments through to regional initiatives and also more bespoke bilateral approaches. We think about integration not just in terms of Australia's integration with the region, but also integration within the region. And in fact, as some of you might know, the theme of this year's Pacific Island Forum Leaders meeting was Act Now for an Integrated Blue Pacific Continent. Turning to the motivations for integration, it's true, Australia, we absolutely do want to be the Pacific's partner of choice. We are, in a large majority of cases. We are the region's largest and most comprehensive development partner, as many of you know better than me. We're the region's largest economic partner and, of course, we're its most significant security partner. We are listening to what our partners are asking of us, and we are working really hard to try and deliver on that. You can see I'm old school. I still write my own notes. I'm not sophisticated to have a computer in front of me. Bridi, again, I'm echoing a lot of what you've already said, but I think it's just, you can see even from our Foreign Minister and Minister Conroy, it's a subject that's dear to their heart, just through their recent speeches, as you said, Bridi, just a couple of weeks ago. But the Foreign Minister, she's been very clear now for a long time that we do face a permanent contest, including in the Pacific. What that means in practice, though, is that we have to try harder, which is actually a really good thing for the Pacific. Again, as the Foreign Minister said, we need to meet nations where they are at and to draw on all elements of our national power. And that's absolutely what we need to do when we think about integration with the Pacific. We are drawing on our world-class education and health systems. We're leveraging our economic strengths. We're harnessing the affinity between our people. And increasingly through our First Nations diplomacy, we're really elevating and building on those deep historical and cultural connections. The Foreign Minister's also said very clearly now that with so much activity and contest, things may not go Australia's way every time. But we will keep pressing. We'll continue to pursue how new alignments can better pursue our national interests while evolving traditional ideas of like-mindedness. We are seeking to create more common ground and to transform that into shared opportunities. Bridi, I think, as you said, and certainly in the paper, I absolutely agree that there is now more political will, there's greater institutional mobilisation and an increased risk appetite for initiatives in the Pacific, more than I've seen in my more than 25 years working in our foreign ministry. What that means is that we're really able to do some quite transformational things in recent years in the Pacific, whether it's through supporting airlines or banking or infrastructure, things that when I started in the foreign ministry were completely outside the purview of foreign policy at that time. We've created new mobility opportunities, including the PEV, as Natasha spoke about. And of course, we've been able to finalise some really groundbreaking agreements with Tuvalu through our Falapeli Union, Nauru, PNG with our Puk Puk Treaty, and of course with more on the way. So what are the results so far, or more importantly, where are we at? We have achieved greater integration of our economies. We've had more than 40 years now of tariff-free access for the Pacific to Australia. We've seen increased trade with the Pacific. It's up 23% since 2019. And last year in 2024, Australia imported more than $9 billion of goods and services from the Pacific. Of course, as already mentioned, we are ensuring the presence of Australian banks in 9 Pacific Island countries, and that's really to deliver those essential banking services. Our Pacific families, our businesses and tourists are now better connected thanks to new and upgraded airports, seaports and roads, as well as more flight routes, and that's including through the Palau Paradise Express and the Australian North Pacific Connector, which the Australian government supports. It's not all one way though. I think there's a tendency to think of Pacific Islanders coming to Australia, but in 2023, more than 600,000 Australians visited the Pacific, and I'm sure when the data's available, we'll see that those numbers have increased substantially in more recent years. Digital services are expanding. They're becoming faster and more reliable, as every Pacific country is connected by undersea cables, many of which are really thanks in large part to very, very significant investments from the Australian government. We are creating more pathways for Pacific Islanders to come and live, study and work in Australia. Our labour mobility program, the PALM scheme, remains our signature, what we call circular mobility offering to the Pacific. I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, but we do provide preferential access to Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste. They are the only countries that have access to that program. This government in particular has really made a significant investment, $440 million actually, to grow and strengthen that scheme. One of the things that we're especially proud of is we've been able to embed in our labour mobility program a skills dividend that's unique to the PALM scheme. That's really broadened the value proposition for our partner governments. Remittances are still incredibly important for many of our participating countries, but equally now our partners can leverage PALM in ways to strengthen and grow their own domestic labour mobility markets. Skills remains a very important and valued contribution from Australia. We're still the region's largest supporter of skills. We've supported more than 20,000 Pacific Islanders to graduate with full Australian qualifications. Education, that will always be a priority for us. Through our investments with the University of South Pacific, we're supporting more than 4,000 Pacific Islanders graduate with tertiary qualifications every year. That's in addition to our Australian awards, and you can see how valuable they are sitting here today, but more than 13,000 of those awards go to Pacific Islanders every year. We've mentioned the PEV, and something they're really proud of is the Falafeli visa, and again, very happy to answer more questions about those in the Q&A. Of course, sport, it's a shared passion between Australia and almost every single Pacific Island country. You'll all be familiar with our NRL agreement with PNG. We've just named the team, you will have seen, the PNG Chiefs. I think it's a fabulous name, even though I don't know much about NRL, I have to say. But it's more than the NRL. We have a suite of grassroots sports programs across the Pacific that really are supporting to develop the next generation of leaders. They're encouraging healthy lifestyles, and of course they're helping women and girls to participate fully in our communities. Defence and security, it will remain an important part of our relationship, bilateral and regionally in the region. We continue to support Pacific-led, Australian-backed regional initiatives, and of course the disaster response, humanitarian response and preparedness will always be an important element in the Pacific. So what's the end point? I think, in fact, Minister Conroy said it best. He said the challenge for Australia remains how we navigate today's increasingly tough strategic environment in the Pacific in a way that protects our national interests, supports our partners, builds a resilient region, and acknowledges the existential threat from climate change. And for me, integration, Australia's integration with the Pacific, but also within the region, that is absolutely a key part of responding to that challenge. And thanks very much, Darren.
Great. Thanks, Jan. Okay, as I warned you, I'm going to abuse my chair privileges and ask one question of each of our panellists before turning the floor over to you guys. And Natasha, I wanted to start with you and something you said at the very end of your remarks. You used the phrase new frontier. And we could call that integration, we could call it something else, but the sense that there is something new. And I wanted to get a sense what that feels like on the ground at home. You know, is this something that is, how is it experienced by people of your country? Is it something they want? Is it something they feel they have agency over? Or is it being, you know, imposed upon them? Can you talk a bit about sort of what it feels like on the ground, this new frontier, what your hopes and expectations are?
That's a very big, loaded question. Well, when the PEV was launched last year, there was over 56,000 primary applicants who registered. This year, more than 61,000 registered. So the numbers speak for themselves. There is incredibly high interest Pacific-wide for the region. Perhaps for other countries who've had a longer history of engaging in other permanent migration schemes, particularly with New Zealand under the PAC, the Pacific Access Category, and I guess other Pacific Island countries that have a longer tradition of migrating into Australia. For those countries, and sadly this is for the Melanesian countries, we haven't had that same, I'm going to say, privilege of accessing these kinds of migration pathways to Australia. So for us, it's a new migration trend. Since when did we think Australia was going to give us the PEV? Probably never. So it is an incredibly exciting opportunity for those countries who have
a low diaspora in Australia and history of low migration, out-migration, you know, the idea that you will be able to take your family with you and access better healthcare than you would back home, I mean, that's a massive opportunity for us. And that's not to say that, you know, we want to leave home. I think if the conditions back home were just as good as they are here in Australia, then we wouldn't see the need to leave home. But having said that, and this comes back to the debate around the brain gain and brain drain points that people are going to raise, because we feel that, you know, Papua New Guinea, we're going to be losing all our skilled people to the PEV. But it's a ballot. It's a random selection. Anybody can register in the PEV so long as you're 18 to 45 years of age. And it's transferring the agency to the individual, which makes it exciting because you have less barriers to access this opportunity. It's not governed by another government body that says you have to, you know, be from this area, you have to have this amount of money. If you've only got $25 in your account, people can save. It's only $25. In PNG, that's 75 kina. You know, you have this life-changing opportunity to access your human rights. And this is why I get a bit defensive when somebody says, oh, we shouldn't allow our people to leave. Well, then why don't you give them better conditions back home? You have no right to deny them to better healthcare, better education, but that's what we're facing in the region. And so obviously, Australia is going to have to be dealing with high interest from the Pacific to migrate. Obviously, countries are going to question the quota allocations, Fiji in particular, because their quota under the PEV is 300. They had 3 times more people who registered. And then, of course, me from PNG saying we need our own exclusive PR pathway because we're just that big. But yeah, I mean, it's a new and exciting opportunity, especially for countries who have not had this history of out-migration. So for us, yeah, it's on the ground. Everybody wants a PEV.
Thank you. Jan, when I was listening to Bridi's introduction, and you see security, economics, development, people, all on one slide, I was reminded of a debate that I'm much more familiar with on what is now called economic security. If we wind back in time 7 or 8 years, you had 2 tribes, as they were famously described in Canberra. These are the economists and the strategists, national security hawk types, who were at each other's throats about what it meant that we had weaponised interdependence, what it meant that we were vulnerable, how should the government manage economic policy in an era of rising geopolitical competition. And more broadly, you had these different communities who had different worldviews, different frames of reference, different languages that were trying to talk to each other and not doing a very good job of it, at least initially. And I think we've come a long way in the last 5-7 years to integrate, you might say, those different policy domains. It strikes me that this is a similar kind of example where, you know, when I did development economics 15, 20 years ago, and you learned about development, it was building schools and hospitals. It was about economic development in those countries. And now geopolitics, partner interests are all being mixed together. So I wanted you just to sort of comment about the concept of integration where people can draw what they want, their own, inside government, and the challenges that presents in cohering policy.
Thanks very much, Darren. Yeah, I think you're right, and I think you hit on it when you said, you know, when we were trying to talk to each other. I think what we've gotten better at is listening to each other, because, you know, when we talk about this permanent contest in our region, for Australia, we do have very significant national interests. This is our home, this is a region where we live, and what happens in the Pacific affects our own national security. But But we know for the Pacific, right, the thing that's front and centre on their mind is economic development. It's the existential threat of climate change. So I think what we've gotten better at is listening to each other's priorities and responding to those. So I think it's not a binary discussion that you're either talking about security or you're talking about economic development. I mean, it's hard to have one without the other. And for me, it's been an absolute privilege. In my team, we work on or responsible for those mobility pathways, the PEV included our PALM scheme, but I also have the team where we were involved in the negotiations of the Falapeli Union. It's one of the most important things that I've had the privilege of working on. We're now working, Patrick here down the front, to implement that mobility pathway. We negotiated the Nauru Australian Treaty. We're now doing one with Vanuatu. You may have read the Nakamal Agreement, and we're just starting with Fiji and Tonga. And I mean, each of those agreements, they came about at the request of our partner governments, and they are comprehensive agreements. So they cover, as you say, Darren, a suite of economic issues, suite of mobility issues, a suite of security issues, and also some cultural elements. So I think we look at it and we think about it in a much more holistic way.
Bridi, I want to ask you a version of the same question. You've deliberately used integration as an umbrella term, and you've got the 4 domains: interoperability, alignment, conversions of interest. It's a lot bundled into one single agenda. And as someone who is famous for very clear thinking, I sort of wanted you to react to the trade-offs in trying to keep all these different conflicting agendas, thoughts, worldviews in your head at the same time. How does that play out in the communities, in your work and in the development community when you engage with it?
I think I prefer your podcast when you give me the questions ahead of time. I mean, honestly, there are times where the reason you try and write a little paper, and this is just simply, a survey of what's happening, you decide to write it because you need to somehow make sense of things, and I think that's the case here. When we go through consultation with different people about what integration is, I can tell you, some people just say this is not a thing. It's not a thing. I can't see it, I can't measure it. Clearly they haven't met Jan before, who runs an integration division. It's not a thing. We still do aid, we do security, and we do other stuff. And then there are other people at the other end of the spectrum who turn around and say, well, duh, of course this is Australia's agenda, an agenda in the negative sense of the word, not the neutral sense that we use it. And so actually moving between those worlds is super confusing, right? But at the same time, this is not the first sort of moment where a think tank on the outside of government is trying to read the tea leaves and say, hey, there's a motivation here. And it's certainly not the first moment where you have a word that means different things to different people. I mean, think resilience, right? You can talk to a climate change advocate about resilience and you're talking about climate adaptation. I talked to Darren about resilience and he's thinking about economies and US tariffs. Or I talked to, a national security colleague and they're thinking about resilience from foreign interference, right? Integration is the same term. It's not a perfect term. It's the short word that you can put on the front page of a paper that means enough to make sense. The concern I have consistently and persistently is that whenever in Australian foreign policy we have terms that are nebulous, I would put national interest in this category, I would put resilience in this category, now integration. Whenever we kind of just all pretend to each other we know what we're talking about, then it can be misdirected on the ground. Now, those that work in Canberra might be, concerned about how DFAT might redirect that. My primary concern is what happens on the ground if this agenda is not clear. Because integration for a developmental outcome would mean when we are negotiating the terms of a deal like the Digicel acquisition deal, we are looking to maximise the chance that people in Papua New Guinea can have maximum access to low-cost internet. If we're thinking developmentally about Falapeli, then you would see what we saw, which is a really significant development investment in land reclamation as part of that treaty, right? But if it is not clear, if it is not named, that there is a development aspiration on behalf of Australia here, then guess what? The dominant policy communities in this town will ensure that the dominant paradigm of that conversation is only competition. Now, I'm not denying that there is geostrategic competition out there. I just know that when Australia acts in the region, we don't have to act only because of that. So I think, Darren, you know, we will continue to talk and understand and listen amongst all these communities. But what I am sort of after always, and the same was with the development policy, is a little bit of ring fencing around development for what. And we got that out of the development policy, for better or for worse. It's poverty alleviation because more sustainable countries in our region is in Australia's national interests, right? That was a level of clarity we hadn't had for the decade prior. And on this, I think there's opportunity to get that level of clarity. For every PEV integration activity, you will also hear a lot of concern about things like the NRL deal or others. So I think that sort of clarity around how are we integrating, for what purpose, and what is the end game is not here. But that's natural, right? This is new. It's topsy-turvy. We're gripping it all up. And I think that's a natural way that foreign policy in this country is often made. It is often an idea first, and we work out the details later. That's how feminist foreign policies come about in other countries as well.
Okay, well, it's your turn. So please introduce yourself. Please include at least a question somewhere. And ma'am, in the pink, I can see you had your hand up.
Firstly, thanks to all the panelists for the very interesting discussions. My question is to Jen Hutton. Bula Jen, my name is Natasha. I'm from the Australian High Commission in Suva, and I work very closely with PSE, which is one of the sections in your division. My question is linked to Australia's new international development policy. I particularly enjoyed your comments around supporting integration within the region. And as we know, the policy has a big focus on localization. So my question is, what role do you think the Pacific regional organizations like USP or SPC have in supporting the integration agenda? And what role do locally engaged staff like myself across DFAT's network in the Pacific have in supporting that integration agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I had the pleasure of being in Suva just last week, walking off the plane into that warmth. I love it every time. Let me start with LES and then I'll come back to your regional institutions question. I mean, LES, locally engaged staff, in our system, they are just absolutely essential and vital. They're the ones who hold all of the knowledge, all of the corporate memory, and I'm sure it's the case for Fiji and every other country. So for me, you are evidence of integration in practice. You come out and you spend time in Australia, you probably end up knowing more about us than we know about ourselves, and then you go home and put that knowledge and experience and expertise to work. And really it's such a force multiplier in our bilateral relationships, but also regionally as well. So thank you. Your question on USP and other regional institutions, absolutely essential. We think of ourselves as the Pacific family. The Pacific Island Forum, as you know, is the centrepiece of that. But all of those other regional institutions as well, what they reflect is a recognition and an understanding of what I said at the start, their shared spaces. And a very smart gentleman in your system, Dr. Lessie, it's actually his term that I've stolen, this idea of shared spaces. And it's really a reflection that we have shared challenges and that we will be stronger in responding to those challenges together. Just a word on the University of South Pacific in particular that falls in my area of responsibility. I had the pleasure of going to my first council meeting last year in Auckland. I mean, it's such a precious institution. I know that Pacific Island countries, some of them have their own national universities, which are also equally important, making an equally valuable contribution. But for me, USP to have a regional university is representative of how we think about ourselves and what our shared aspirations are for ensuring that we are educating our young peoples and our future leaders for the region.
Great. Oh, someone's been identified.
Hello.
Thank you.
I'm Stephen Howes here from the Development Policy Centre. Thank you to Bridi for putting on this session. Thank you to all the speakers. I think both Bridi and Jan mentioned the end game or the end point of integration. I want to ask all the speakers, what do you think is the end point or the end game? And just to make it a bit more specific, I mean, what I think, it is that free movement of people. It's the Australia-New Zealand relationship expanded through the Pacific. And so I guess my question is, do you agree? Or if not, what is your vision of the end game? Thank you.
So I don't want to be an academic, but I am going to quote. So Leah Clarenberg defines what integration is. She's a migration researcher based at the University of Frankfurt. She defines integration as a two-way process of a social change that involves renegotiating social relations, power, and boundaries between all members of society. So it's not just about newcomers or new migrants adjusting to Australia's societal norms, but established members of society, and we can include the diaspora, also adjusting their identities and practices to make integration a dynamic and reciprocal process. And I stress on reciprocal. I think when we say integration, the end game for me is when there is equal reciprocity. So if Australia can come into PNG visa-free, then I should also come into Australia visa-free. If Australia can trade with me and send me corn, then I should be able to send you corn too. There must be reciprocity as the end game for integration, to me, Stephen. And I have written about this on several other papers that at a bilateral level for PNG, that the Australia and New Zealand Trans-Tasman Agreement is kind of that end game for the two countries. NRL, Pukpuk Treaty aside, it will not really truly achieve integration if we do not have that kind of high-level Trans-Tasman agreement between the two countries that will open up all economic integration opportunities for the country. Yeah, so for me, in short, integration endgame means equal reciprocity.
Thanks, Stephen. Nice to see you. Almost hiding up the back. I don't think there is an endpoint to integration. When you look at even one of the most integrated regions in the world, the European Union, the EU, right? It's still evolving, it's changing, it's adapting all the time. And I think that will be the case for Australia and the Pacific. I think for us, we think about integration, even though I'm particularly interested in the mobility space, it's much broader than that. The economic space, the cultural space, the people-to-people connection space. And if you look at the economic space, there's new challenges emerging all the time. AI, for example, digital connectivity, how do we navigate those new areas? How do we integrate in those new areas? So it will continue to evolve. Perhaps you can argue in the economic space the end game is where our Pacific partners are more prosperous than Australia and we're looking to them for development support. In the mobility space though, I think one of the challenges we're constantly grappling with, and this goes to your end game point, but it might take me a minute to get there, is we've heard consistently from the Pacific calls for increased access to Australia, increased mobility. But for individuals and for different Pacific Island countries and their governments, that can look slightly different. Some people, they want that ability to just come and go. For others, they want that ability to come down and work in Australia but then return home. And then for others, they want that permanent residency pathway like we have through the PEV. So we are really, as I said, looking to provide choices, but leaving it to Pacific Island country governments to decide what the right mix is for them. I mean, we've heard the concerns with brain drain. We absolutely know how important it is for the Pacific Island countries to be able to cultivate, harness and keep their own skilled people. So I think when it comes to mobility, there will be a tipping point for some Pacific Island governments whereby those concerns with keeping those skills, strengthening their own domestic labour markets is a choice between which of those mobility pathways they wish to take up with Australia. But for integration more broadly, as I said, I don't think that we'll ever get there. I don't think I'll ever be out of a job anyway, Stephen.
In terms of what the end game of integration should be, I guess, Stephen, I think it's probably worth recognising for everybody else here that the idea for this panel actually came from a conversation that we had about just how compelling the development results are when it comes to freer movement, right? And for those who were at the panel event yesterday on this, you would have seen the data up on the wall here around, yes, some of the challenges with this stuff, but also just how critical remittances are to the Pacific and that genuine integration outcome that you get from those migratory pathways were there, right? And so that's where the idea of this first came from. And so I think it would be, with my developmental hat on, very easy to be saying, okay, the end game is just more of what works. Okay, and I think that that's obviously a big part of it. I'm not the expert in that. Others in this room are. But the concern I have at the moment is that might be the end game on the minds of people in this room, but the unspoken end game on the minds of others is simply keeping China out of the Pacific. That is the end game, the only game for many people in the Australian government at the moment. Now, of course, that might be relevant. I don't have the national security data to back it up. But if that is your end game, then you're acting very, very, very differently. So what I do think, and you know, this is hopefully the next piece of work that we do as our thinking on this evolves, is how do we play out those scenarios? Because I don't necessarily think Australia is ready to say the end game is freedom of movement, full stop, here we go, and let go all of those other competing motivations. But as long as we kind of hedge our bets and spread ourselves super thin across an integration agenda, what do we know as development practitioners? When spread super thin, you're everything to everyone and sometimes not a very good partner to the ones that matter most. So I think what we're thinking about doing next would be to build out those scenarios. What does a scenario of a fully integrated, freer Pacific and Australia look like? What does a legitimate scenario built around resilience and fostering and reducing the risks of foreign interference look like in the region? And play that out, because at some point in time, because of the budget pressures that are going to be coming at this government, choices are going to need to be made. And I think as a community, we want the data sets, not just on labour mobility, but whether or not the NRL deal pays good dividends influence-wise or development-wise. We want the data set about how the Pacific Banking Guarantee is playing out as well. So it would be my aspiration that we don't necessarily have an articulated end state, but we have much clearer what are the hierarchy of goals we're going after in this integration agenda. And obviously my bias is let's make sure that development is front and centre and a big part of that agenda, because the potential is huge, notwithstanding the tensions over sovereignty and elsewhere.
And I wouldn't be a good political scientist if I didn't point out that whatever the end game is, it is politically constrained in this country by probably whatever the coalition finds acceptable. And so we've made remarkable strides in getting bipartisanship, albeit faint, on these issues, but we're pushing against the tide globally, right? This is a world where borders are hardening, not softening. and everyone in this room needs to be aware of that the politics of this will be a very rapid constraint if they're not played very, delicately. Okay, who's next? This is very convenient. Someone's doing my work for me. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Anna from UPNG, University of PNG. My question is for Jan. Coming from a donor perspective, and speaking of integration of shared interests, which one do you think is more important? Is it providing assistance or aid in governance and civil society, which PNG receives which is the highest in PNG and the Pacific, or the more pressing needs such as education, water and sanitation, which is 16 times less than aid in governance and civil society. And yeah, I just want to know if it's truly in the spirit of integration of shared interests, or is it the donors' priorities, or they have their own agenda? Because if you look at the NRL agreement, if you ask the citizens, the local daily grassroots, they'll say that, oh, I think 600 is just a waste of money. It should be spent on more pressing needs than setting up a rugby team. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Look, it's a really good question. I think you can't say that one is more important than the other, and I think everyone in this room understands you often can't have one without the other. You can't choose education at the expense of health, or health at the expense of good governance. I think the challenge for us, and this is an ongoing challenge, is finding the right balance. The government has increased very significantly, as you know, the size of our ODA spend, our development expenditure in the Pacific. It's now well over $1 billion, but it's not finite. And it doesn't meet all of the Pacific's needs all of the time. I think, and there's more challenges, there's more needs that come on as things evolve. So striking that balance is an ongoing challenge. You mentioned the NRL. I mean, that absolutely reflects priority of the PNG government. I don't think, any Australian government would have sat there and, dreamed up off our own bat that the thing that PNG most wants is an NRL team. It was very much reflects the PNG government saying to us, this is really important to us. This is something that's going to matter in our relationship and matter to our people. But I think it's also important to understand that that's one aspect of our bilateral relationship, and all of those other areas you talked about and many more will continue to go forward.
Natasha, do you have a view? Oh,
So last year, I pitched for a PNG engagement visa at the 3 map that was sponsored by the Development Intelligence Lab that I won. And yeah. And I dedicated that to PNG and the Pacific. But it comes back to like what Anna, our governments, we tend to be playing the China card all the time. We do it really well now, actually. And while we, like to question Australia's genuineness in the region, we've also become a little ingenuine in our own dealings with Australia. And so, when I hear that PNG government, it was upon their request for the NRL, it was also our idea for the Puk Treaty. The question, it begs the question, well, we don't have power. We don't have medicine in the hospitals. And so it is easy for us to get frustrated with the PNG government as well as with the Australian government for not looking, or for overlooking the obvious, I guess. And then what do we do as PNG citizens or citizens from the Pacific? We can't obviously blame Australia all the time. We also have to blame our governments. And we have every right to do so because we pay taxes to them. We don't pay taxes to Australia. They give us their tax money. So I feel that whilst Australia is doing great work in the Pacific, whether that's in competition with China or just, advancing the agenda for a truly Pacific integrated family, we as citizens of the Blue Pacific also have to put pressure on our own members, even our regional institutions. If PIFS is the regional body, then how do we, whether you're an LAS or somebody in NGO, private sector, what can we do in our own, spheres of influence to make them accountable so we have the same healthcare systems that Australia does? I think sometimes, most often, we are quite hard on Australia, but we should also be as harder and tougher on our own governments. Because if Papua New Guinea, you are calling for an NRL team and you are calling for a Puk Puk treaty, but you are not calling for male medicine in the hospital, then something is not right.
Hi everyone, thank you for a very good discussion this morning. I'm James Cox from Pacifica. Some work I was doing a few years ago, a gentleman in Honiara said to me, I could jump in my canoe and I could paddle away and follow the bubbles on the water from island to island and I'd get to Australia. And to me this was a really lovely example of the way in which Solomon Islanders in particular have a sense of awareness of and connection to Australia and its historical, its cultural, its genetic as well. And I've often thought it'd be fun to test it to see how many people in Australia will be able to jump in a tinny and make the reverse journey. And this speaks to me to one of those asymmetries that exist between Australia and the region, and we mostly think about how Australia is so huge and the Pacific countries are very small and don't have as many resources, but Pacific people know an awful lot more about us than we do about them by and large, outside this privileged environment that we're in now, of course. So I guess two strands to this question, one to Jan and one to you, Natasha. And the question to Jan is, it's not DFAT's job by and large to sort of shift awareness in the Australian public generally, but it should be a really important part of what's being done in integration. So I guess what's happening on that side of things. And to Natasha, does it actually matter as much as we think it does, and does it affect the way the Pacific people, you can speak for all of them of course, the way in which Pacific people feel welcome or otherwise in Australia, the degree to which we have an awareness of where you're coming from?
Thanks very much for your question. First thing I'd say, luckily, my division is not solely responsible for integration in the Pacific, either in DFAT, but also across government. Integration really, that point about using all of our national powers, so much of it sits outside of DFAT, Department of Home Affairs, Department of Employment, Workplace Relations, Defence, etc. So it really is a whole of government effort. More so than I have witnessed or seen in any other bilateral relationship. So my last job, I was responsible for a division that looked after our bilateral relationship with the US. It had the UK, Canada, our Quad partners, etc., etc. And the level of engagement across government is absolutely more intense in the Pacific than in any of those other very big bilateral relationships. Your question about knowledge within Australia of the Pacific. I think it's an absolutely fair point, and a key motivation behind the PEV. One of the reasons the government wanted to create the PEV, and any of you who followed it, you could see it was hotly contested, it didn't have bipartisan support, was a very deliberate decision to grow our Pacific diasporas. We felt the Pacific was underrepresented in our migration program, and we wanted more Pacific Islanders to have the experience of coming, living in Australia, enriching our communities, as we also do through the PALM program. So I think hopefully we will see as we get into future years and we have more PEV holders, we have more Fallapelli visa holders as our PALM scheme continues to grow. We'll have more Pacific Islanders here in Australia. We did just a couple of weeks ago have our first Fallapelli baby, which we're really proud about. But also we're pushing further out in Australia. At the start of this year, we started a PALM pilot in the early childhood education and care sector, and we had Papua New Guinean, actually ECEC workers that come down. They're actually working in really remote communities in Alice Springs and Katherine. Can you imagine, right? And they are just making such an enormous contribution to those very small communities. They've enabled, or they've created childcare places that didn't exist, enabling parents to go return to work. But also they're contributing to our community. We've seen PALM workers, right? They've helped out when we've had floods. They're engaged in our churches. They're making our sporting teams stronger. So the more we can grow those communities, those diasporas, or even temporarily have Pacific Islanders here, the richer we will be for sure.
Your question, I cannot speak on behalf of the Pacific. In fact, I also cannot speak on behalf of PNG, which is why I love being an academic. But when we talk about, and I mentioned this in the video when I said any kind of migration governance is going to manage talent flows in and out of the region, includes not only the Pacific becoming more Australian literate, but also Australians becoming more Pacific literate, which I think, particularly for PNG, given this, we always like to describe the relationship as deep and enduring. But if you ask an Australian, where's Papua New Guinea, they know Fiji. They don't know Papua New Guinea, even though we're the closest country to Australia. And so while we are taught at school everything there is to know about Australia when we gained independence from Whitlam, which Labor government then, not many Australians have been taught at school that the Pacific consists of this many countries. You've got 3 sub-regional blocks. We do have Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. This is our General Secretary. These are the Prime Ministers. This is when the countries gained independence and from which colonial administrator at the time. That information is not transferred. And so it's not surprising as you get older that you need to become more Pacific literate because you haven't been cultivated in that early formative years of your life, which is going to change the way you look at the Pacific, the way you interact with the Pacific. And so if you only see Polynesians for most of your life, you will think that the Pacific is made up of the Polynesians. But no. So I think, how do you incorporate some kind of Pacific literacy within the education system here in Australia that actually shows that you want to know more about the Pacific? It's okay to send, foreign officers abroad who have already, developed a deep understanding and appreciation of the region. And we get here at DPA, the DFAT, I call them the DFATers, but we have a session with them where we explain to them all these nuances, the tensions in the region, to better prepare them before they go out. But if you talk to somebody back home about what you need to know before you get into Australia, we already know. We know exactly what we can and cannot do after we're granted a visa. So, yeah, I think it's also coming back to Australia, and whilst you want to make sure that we have the same accredited training programs that's going to allow freer movement between the two countries, there's also some work to do here in Australia in becoming, more Pacific literate just about your neighborhood.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. And just going back, Jan, to I'm Colette from Adapsis, by the way. Sorry, forgot to introduce myself. Jan, you mentioned that Australia's integration interests are about ensuring we live in a stable, peaceful, prosperous region. And Bridi, you made a really good point and a question at the end of your presentation that resonated around what happens when our partners have a misalignment with the support we're providing. And in saying that, we've been providing decades of support and having partners, being a preferred partner to many partners in the region. So what happens when there's a misalignment? So for example, some of our partners sign or have an interest with other partners, sign security agreements after decades of support. What are the measures of success? How successful? We've got a lot of feel-good stories about increased mobility and it feels and sounds great. So just going back to that question, Bridi, if we could.
Okay, so I think that was a polite version of the question of what happens when a Pacific Island country signs up to China when Australia has struck a deal requiring that they don't. Right. So yeah, cool.
A diplomatic way.
So, I mean, quite frankly, who knows, okay? And I'd imagine that that's a central concern of lots of Australian government officials as well, and I'm certainly not privy to any of those conversations whatsoever. But playing it out theoretically, you have a few choices, right? You can play hardball, or you can play softball, right? And the Australian way is to play softball behind closed doors, generally speaking. So in a perfect world, your relationship is so good that you have detected the signals that that other partner is about to do something and you've headed it off at the pass in some way, shape or form. Australia has some of the best diplomats on the planet. We're not bad at doing some of these behind closed doors conversations. At the same time, Natasha has very eloquently said that, other countries are good at playing the China card. So that's getting harder and harder. So I do think that the possibility of a breach of one of these obligations is more and more likely. So we saw it with Cooks in New Zealand, like I mentioned it before. And should these countries be making decisions that our government is pretty unimpressed with at that point in time, for better or for worse, then they're going to have a choice. And that is to exercise that leverage, that concern, withdraw aid at the time, threaten to withdraw an NRL team. Like, I'm talking worst case scenario going around. They're going to face that choice. Now, at this point in time, I can see no evidence whatsoever of the Australian government wanting to play leverage with its aid program. I can't see it. It's something that we have not done, most likely would not do. But that's going to get tougher, I would predict. But I would say that if Australia did choose in a situation where there was a breach, one of our partner countries signed up to something that we don't necessarily want them doing, would we choose to withdraw aid at that point in time? I think it would be highly problematic, and I think it would be a short-term reaction that would be an own goal. Because ultimately, I think this government and a lot of people in this room realise that trust with the Pacific, that relationality, is absolutely supreme. It comes above anything else. And the second that Australia started playing really hard leverage by looking to withdraw cash, withdraw the things that the Pacific want the most, PEVs, I mean, that could be a tool of leverage at some point in time, then I think your stocks and trusts would just plummet. That said, in 3 or 5 years' time, things are going to get tougher. You're seeing Trump becoming more transactional, our partners as well. That pressure is going to come at this government, and I think it's untested at the moment as to what we would do, and that's just the truth. It's a new era.
It's 1 o'clock. Can you thank our panelists? That was excellent.